Sorry, you can probably hear in the background the miking. Anyways,
No, I
right. So
say that it's actually in the best tradition of Bengali studentship and
right.
that you have a demonstration outside.
Right. Thank you. Now, we are opening up this session with Professor Rosinka Chaudhary, and who I'll invite one volunteer to step forth and ask his or her question. Right. Who would like to go first? Right.
Amrita, may I speak?
Rosinka, this is our student Lokhinarayan Mukhopadhyay. Right, just give her a moment, please. Yes.
Okay, no, I just thought I'd get a notebook in case I needed to write the question. But if I don't need to, then I won't. So
right. Lokhi, go ahead, please. Lokhi.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone. My question is that as far as we have read Desrosiers, Desrosiers has encouraged only the elite, what's usually we call the Babu Bengali. One thing which hesitates me that Desrosiers makes a, is it he makes a kind of claim that look at me and then follow me as a singular figure. So doesn't he has fallen in the tropes of Edward Said's Orientalist idea that of positional superiority? So his as we have also seen that his uses of heaven and hell, which also makes a kind of comparison that Europe is kind of heaven and East is a kind of hell, or it's kind of unrepresentable kind of thing. And so another thing which also reminds me that he is considered to be called as India's first national English poet. So could it be fair enough to call him as the first Indian national poet when the identity of nationality as India as a nation didn't exist there during the time? So because India was the colonized country of the Britain. So that is the another thing. And also if we look at the poem My Native Land to India, my native land, he has never used the word India once again in the lines of the poem. So he has just only used to India, my native land. So if we remove the title, there is no hint will be left to say that the poem is talking about India. And again, he is talking about the societal beliefs, challenges, and conventional notions. But if we remove the title, then it will be like a kind of flesh of the body. The title is just like a flesh of the body. If we remove, we will find that it is nothing but the skeleton of a kind of European superiority. Like if we put them to Portugal, my native land, to England, my native land, it will be the same. So these are my questions. So can you please enlighten?
Lokhi, before Rosinka answers that, right. Let me just remind you that I had reminded you in class that the title was not given by Desrosiers, actually. Right. Anyways, Rosinka, I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
Okay, so that answers one of the questions. I was going to say that you have actually asked not one, but about 3 or 4 questions. And that's why I then quickly began to sort of make a note about all the points that you want me to address. The first and most simple answer to the question about the title of the poem being To India, My Native Land has been answered already by Professor Sen. And that is the simple fact that it was not actually given by Desrosiers. It was a later description. Later editor sort of thought of a title for this poem that was actually found in his notebooks without a title, and that was the title that was given to it in later years. Now, that is, of course, the factual answer to what you're asking. But the more interesting sort of, thought in relation to the larger issue you're raising, where you're basically saying what was India at that time. That is the more interesting question, really. And that can be answered in a number of ways. So the first thing to remember, of course, that is that this is very early. Derozio has died by 1831. Now, even if you look at the writings of Rammohn Roy, who is the other Indian. There's some disturbance from somebody's mic. I think that's gone now. Yeah, so as I was saying, if you look at Rammohn's own writings, until he actually goes to England and answers questions on, the country, so there were, not only was the term India not, in use except by the British in their official communications, the terms Hindu and Musalman also were completely new categories. The Hindus never referred to themselves as Hindus. Neither, in fact, did the Muslims refer to themselves as Muslims. The Hindus called Muslims Mrichu, and the Muslims themselves identified themselves by tribe and country of origin. So, Turkey, or depending on whether you're from Turkey or from Afghanistan or wherever you were from. So these categories, Hindu, Muslim, India, they did not exist in that way. There's a very interesting book that, in fact, I have not actually managed to get my hands on yet. So very recently published by a very well-known historian called Manan Asif Ahmed, who's at Columbia University. He's written a book called The Loss of Hindustan. And here, actually, he talks about the cultural loss that we lost when we forfeited the idea of Hindustan for the idea of India. Now, the idea of Hindustan, of course, is the older, a syncretic idea that belonged to the Persianate texts and Persianate culture. Anyway, so the long and short of it basically being that when they address their country, to India, my native land may not mention India, but it certainly mentions his country. Again and again, he's saying that, he is talking about his own country. First point I will make to you is how interesting it is, and this is the case, of course, that I've made in my book, that a man who is actually half Portuguese and half English has described himself as an Indian and argued for himself as an Indian, in fact, as I've shown in that edition itself. So the idea of India is coming into existence, but it is, in fact, people, not just Derozio himself, but people who belonged to these, what Benedict Anderson calls Creole communities. So if you've read, and I'm sure at some point in your work, so these are, sorry, Amrit, these are BA students, MA students, postgraduate students? Sorry, you're muted. I can't hear you.
Yeah, they are master students.
Master students.
First year master students.
Right. So hopefully then, I cannot take it for granted, but hopefully then you would have perhaps read Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, being a seminal text.
Yeah, they have.
Yeah, as important as Size Orientalism, which you mentioned, in fact. And he over there, if you remember, the first chapter is called Creole Pioneers. And he is making the case that it is, in fact, in South America, that the concept of the nation is, the very concept of the nation is new. So it's not just that India doesn't exist. It's that the concept of the nation itself is just coming into existence. So among the Creole pioneers were led by Simon Bolivar, and this is late 18th century. And these are the first people who are actually talking about the very category of nation. The nation state itself is coming into existence quite, just a few years before Derozio is writing. So Derozio is writing these poems in 1827, 28, 29. This is just 30-40 years before that, the Creole pioneers are actually talking about the nation as a nation state in the sense in which we understand it now. So it's all very new. It's not just that India did not exist at this time, as you rightly point out, but it's also the case that the concept of the nation state itself did not exist in that way at this time. So that's, I'll leave it there because this may come up further in other questions. The other thing that you seem to be driving at, and you referenced, you used the word elite at one point, and then you also spoke towards the end about European superiority, about the poems being written from the vantage point of European superiority. Now, that is a very, very familiar complaint. It is an old complaint, it's a familiar complaint, and it's a complaint that's been made again and again, in fact, towards those who write in English. And if you look at a very interesting book written by one of our best-known poets in English today, Arvind Krishna Mehrotra, who has written a book called Partial Recall. If you look at the introduction to that book, he actually takes up this charge that, oh, these people who write in English, they're all elite. What do they know of the country? What do they know of the peasants? What do they know of anybody? They are just sitting in their what you call European superiority for Derozio. But of course, Derozio is not seeing himself as European at all, and I can say more about that later. And as for superiority, Arvind makes the point that it is not just writers in English who are elite. Anybody who can write in this country is elite. So if you think that somehow, Indian writers in English are more elite than Indian writers in Hindi or Indian writers in Tamil or in Bengali, you will, if you look at the facts, you might find yourself, thoroughly mistaken. So although I recognize that your question comes from a certain balance and a cultural capital that the language English carries with it, even in today's globalized world, and it still does, and I will admit it does, it is very difficult to come to simplistic notions of class, privilege, or elitism from just the fact of the language that you're using, because if that is the
Is this my problem, or is it a problem that many of you are facing?
No, sir. Actually, I am also not hearing from everyone.
All right. Rosinka, we cannot hear you. I'm sorry, the connection seems to have been a little disrupted. I think this is the slightest problem of the internet classes. Let me try and reach Rosinka. She might not be aware that we have a problem here. She's had a power failure, so she's trying to rejoin the meeting. So just please have a little bit of patience. Right. So, as Rosinka, Rosinka is back. Right. Thank you. You muted, Rosinka, please. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. I'm really sorry about that. No. As I was saying to Amrit, something that almost never happens. The power suddenly went. So the router went. So the Wi-Fi connection went. I've connected now to the phone. I hope that we don't. The phone should at least be running without the center's Wi-Fi network. So anyway, so I'll just quickly go back to the. So I was talking therefore about the category elite and about the category of European superiority, both of which, as I hope I've sort of explained, are not categories that can be applied without complicating the argument a little bit, at least, even if you want to apply those categories. So the one of the first questions you asked, in fact, is about him being the first Indian national poet. Were you asking whether he is, in fact, why he is considered the first Indian national poet, or can you just go back to it? Because I just made a note saying first Indian national poet, but I didn't write down what the... Amrit, do you remember what the question was?
Yeah, I think he was asking why. Yeah, okay, you go ahead, please.
Okay, I have asked that would it be fair enough to call him as the first Indian national poet when the idea of India as a nation didn't exist during the time?
Yeah. Okay. So this is a label that is, of course, applied retrospectively. It is not he himself who is calling himself India's first national poet. We are calling him that, or the critics who are choosing to call him that are calling him India's first national poet. There are a number of reasons for this. The reasons being that for the first time, so then now you will have to know a little bit about the literary history of, say, at least this region, Bengal, if not all of India. India at this time in 1827, when he's writing the poems, is different things in different areas. In Maharashtra, the Peshwas are in power. In Punjab, Lahore, Ranjit Singh Ji will soon come to power. It is only in certain East India Company principalities that actually, so there is no such thing as India. There is this place that is referred to as India by the Eastern India Company officials to the territories that they themselves govern. Awadh itself, the Nawab of Awadh, will only become part of this so-called India only after, in the 1850s. So long after Desrosiers is dead. But if we give importance to language, if we look at the manner in which language is used and see how that influences culture, society, politics, then we can see, number one, that poetry is very, very important at this time in the 19th century. It is one of the main things that have a great deal of cultural currency. Everybody reads poetry, everybody is listening to poetry. So now, again, I say listening because there are two distinct areas here. With regard to print culture, print media, yes, we are saying that he is the first Indian national poet. Firstly, because he himself is identifying himself as Indian. I think it is there in my definitive edition where he is arguing and saying that in fact we should call ourselves Indian. Why should we call, this community at this time is arguing that it should find its identity as an Indian community. It didn't, at that time, they were not called Anglo-Indians, mixed race. They wanted to be called East Indians because basically they were East India Company children born of British fathers or European fathers and Indian mothers. So mixed race. They wanted to be known as Indians. They are, in fact, and this is an argument that I have not made in the book, but it can be made now as more and more research is done. They are, in fact, as Creole pioneers, the first people to envisage, India as a country. So because he makes this point politically, because he makes this point in his poetry, because he speaks of his country again and again, we can certainly, I think, claim him as the first Indian national poet, because I don't subscribe to the view either that somehow because he wrote in English, he was inauthentic to who we are as Indians. That's another argument and a different one, but I hope I've answered, to some extent at least, some of the points you've raised in the questions you asked. I have just one request, Amrit. The person who's asking the question, if they can switch on their camera and be on, well, it's very disconcerting not to be able to look at the person you're speaking.
I know. Just one request. Loki, could you please turn on your camera, please, if your data permits you? Right.
Yeah.
The last point that you made, which
Yeah.
you said was not in your book, due to network issues, I think that got a little garbled. Could you just once again repeat that? Because that's a very important part of the answer. I'm sorry for, asking you again, but.
No, certainly. This is something that is formulating itself in my mind only very recently. This is following from new work that is being done by an American scholar called Jessica Woodhouse, who's been corresponding with me and who wants to come and work with me. But basically, she has been excavating a lot of materials and a lot of records to do with what she calls the Creole communities that existed in this part of India long before the British came. And in fact, if you look at Shogoto Bhaduri's new book, Polycoloniality, you'll see that he too is more or less on the same track, in that he's also then making the case that there was a colonial presence in Bengal long before the British came. 1757 we date it to, right? That's when we say that the British presence in India began to consolidate. Of course, they were here as merchants before that, but that's when it began to consolidate politically. The point that Shogoto is making, and that Jessica is then showing more particularly in relation to Desrosiers himself, is that there is a flourishing Creole community long before that in Bengal. So this is research that is just being done. And that confirms my thinking also, because I also have an essay in Freedom and Beefsteaks which is titled 3 Poets in Search of History, where I'm looking at Desrosiers in relation to, parallel with, Antony Feringhi and Ishwar Gupta. Now, Ishwar Gupta, let's leave out of the equation for now. But if you think of a character like Antony Feringhi also, who we can basically see, who is also Creole. I mean, who is a Creole? Now, this is a question that I always ask my students before I start teaching them Benedict Anderson. But of course, your students already have studied Anderson. But the point, because we don't use the word very much and we are not familiar with it in India so much. But Creole is a person who is purely white. He may be pure white. His mother may be Spanish and his father may be Spanish. It originated in the Spanish colonies. His mother and father may both be Spanish. But because he was born, say, in Argentina or, wherever the Spanish colonies were, he is not given the same rights or the same status as a Spaniard born in Spain. So he is a Creole. He is a Creole person with lesser rights and lesser status in the world than even his parents, who may have been born in Spain and may have come and settled in Latin America. So blood is not the issue here. He is of pure blood, The argument that is being made in relation to now, Desrosiers had some mixed blood in him somewhere, one grandfather, somewhere there is a native grandmother, somewhere, unrecorded. Usually these used to be not recorded in the church registers. Now, Antony Feringhi also belongs to a Creole community. Now, I would like to make the larger point, and I have, in fact, a PhD student who wants to begin work with me on that. The larger point that I'm making, and I'm making it in this Young Bengal book as well, but again, not in a substantial way, because this needs substantial work, is that my basic instinct and understanding from, being immersed in the early 19th century for a very long time, is that it was in fact these Creole communities, and especially the East Indian community, certainly in this time, who far less than talking about European superiority and all of that, and thinking of them as some form of colonizer, who actually thought of themselves as Indian, who was settled here for centuries sometimes. The Portuguese came in the 1500s. So we tend to think, when we think colonial, we think British. But it is, in fact, one simple sort of logic that I like to give, and I've given the example of Rasgulla in my introduction to Freedom and Beefsteaks. Now, Rasgulla, of course, the Portuguese brought the technique of splitting chana to make splitting milk to make chana, from where the Rasgulla originated. It would not have happened unless the Portuguese. So this is 1500s, 1600s. They're bringing that till before that time. If you look at any of the old medieval texts of Bengal, till then, Bengalis or any Indians, in fact, did not split milk. In fact, you could not put if you split milk, nothing of that could be put in front of the gods. So kheer, all our sweetmeats are based on kheer. Anyway, sorry, I'm completely digressing here. But what I mean to say is that these are not, this category of people like Desrosiers or Antony Firinghi do not belong really to some binary of colonizer-colonized, where we poor people are the colonized and European superior people are the colonizers. Because certainly as regards Desrosiers, Antony Firinghi, people like that, these are people whose parents and grandparents' parents may have already been in Bengal for a very long time, which is why they may be identifying as Indian also. But there's been very little work done on this, So hopefully now the research will sort of catch up with, and we'll be able to sort of know a little more about exactly which class, to answer your question. I think your question was also about class, which class and which category these people came from.
Right. Thank you, Rosinka, because that question about Antony Firinghi actually crept up in our class. And if I remember correctly, Lokhi was the person who asked it. Was it Lokhi?
Yes,
I think his question, his other question too, which he raised in class, has been answered by you. Thank you for that. And I think that's fascinating to know what kind of new research is being done here. Right. So let me then, Lokhi, if you could now switch off your microphone and your camera.
Thank you for switching on the video.
Right. Boijonto, you were raising a hand. So should we come to you next? Please switch on your camera. And if it's possible, if your data permits, and then ask the question.
Yes, sir.
Right. Lokhi, you can switch off your camera now.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon.
Ma'am, my question to you are 4. The first one would be, should Desrosiers be called the first hybrid poet in the history of Indian English poetry? And the second would be, is it Desrosiers' intricate romantic merging content and subject which makes him Indian poet? And the third
can you repeat the second one? Can you repeat the second one?
Ma'am, it's the, is it Desrosiers' intricate romantic merging of content and subject which makes him Indian poet? And what was Desrosiers' exact approach towards modernism?
Okay. Sorry, before I answer that question, Amrit, I was wondering, I'm not very familiar with Google Meets, but I know that in Zoom, there's a chat column where you can actually type out the questions you're asking. I was wondering if that can be done, then basically it makes it easier to just look at the question and answer it. Does that option exist in Google?
Yes, it does. So friends, if you could just type your questions in so that Rosinka can take a look at them and we too can go in the order that the questions appear in the chat box. So while she's answering the questions that Boijonto has raised, maybe we could, the other questions that you are asking, you can just type in the chat box.
Okay, so the first question you asked is, should Desrosiers be called the first hybrid poet in India? I will ask you to just clarify that a little bit. Where is Boitonat? Sorry, I do my, anyway, doesn't matter. Can you clarify whether you mean that in terms of language, or do you mean that in terms of race, racially or linguistically? Has this gone?
Probably Boijonto has left the meeting.
I don't see him.
Okay, I'm sorry. This is the great problem of online, interactions.
Yeah, maybe the connection snapped or something. That's
right. Okay, maybe we can go on to someone else. Would someone else and maybe we can answer Boijonto later on.
If he comes back, we can go.
Yeah. Is there anybody who would like to type in a question or ask something maybe?
So while they are typing in a question, somebody is typing in a question. If I can just, sort of quickly say, so with regard to, the question itself about, hybridity, is an interesting one, especially when you think of it in terms of language. Now, in terms of race, I will not. I mean, that's easy to answer. Oh, please come back on.
Yes, come back, Boijanto.
Yeah, Boijanto, I was just saying that, your first question, should Dirozio be called the first hybrid poet in India, or the first hybrid Indian poet? What he's saying was that are you asking the question in terms of language or in terms of race? So, racially or in terms of, if you're sorry, Amrit, can you, yours needs to be
Yeah,
muted.
I think so. Sorry, I'm sorry.
The demonstration is coming quite a lot. That's better. Yeah. So if you mean it racially, of course not. He's not the first hybrid poet. There's no question, because certainly through the history of India, India is a country, even before it existed as India, as I was saying to the previous question, is a mixture of races, right from the time of Amir Khusro, there has been an admixture of races. Now it depends on what you mean by, which race and which nationality. We have been sort of intermingling with many of the races that have come through India for a very long time now, from from ancient times, I would say. So no, certainly, and which one of those poets were racially hybrid or not? It's not. So really, that is not a. I mean, if you look, at least even if you look at from the 11th century onward, from when the Muslim presence in India began, there will be many, many different races that have cohabited with Indians, and many poets born of that intermixture. If you're talking linguistically, that's an even more interesting question, because in fact the most famous poet that the Bengalis had in the 18th century, Bharat Chandra Roy Gunakar, actually himself advocated a language that would be a mixture of whatever could be found at hand. He called it, he said, Otoeb kohi bhasha jaboni mishal. Jaboni being the foreigner or the Yavana, or here the Muslim. Jaboni mishal, by which he meant, I will use Persian words, I will use Sanskrit words, I will use Hindi words, I will use Bengali words. I will use whatever it suits my purposes. And that is the reply I think you'll get from any poet, anywhere in the world, at any time in the world. That is an argument that Borges even made from Argentina in the 20th century, when he wrote Argentine Writer and His Tradition, where he said that the European poetic tradition is the Western poetic tradition is my inheritance, as much as it is the Europeans. So you will find that if you yourself write creatively, or if you know anybody who writes creatively, you will know that anybody who writes creatively will write according to their own predilections, and they will take from whichever influence suits them, whether that is Pablo Neruda, or whether it is James Joyce, or whether it is our very own poet Shakti Chattopadhyay, anybody, so hybridity is creativity in some sense. So I don't think Dirozio can be called India's first hybrid poet. I think India exists, the country itself, I think, exists on a premise of hybridity that may include many other poets who preceded Dirozio. So that's my answer to that first question. Now, I couldn't quite understand what exactly you meant by the second question, which was to do with the romantic merging of content and form, did you say? Or what exactly were you asking? I couldn't understand.
Content and subject. Content and subject.
But content and subject is the same thing, no?
Sorry, style and subject. I'm very sorry. Style and subject.
Okay.
Very.
So you're saying that the romantic merging of style and subject led to what? What is the question?
To him being called the first romantic, first Indian poet. I mean, did it contribute to the factor?
Okay. To him being called the first Indian poet. Okay. Now, again, that's actually a question that has many very interesting answers that could be given to it. I will answer you by taking you to an essay not an essay, an introduction that Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay wrote in 1885 to a collection of the poems of his predecessor, Ishwar Gupta. Now, Ishwar Chandra Gupta was a very famous poet in 19th century Bengal. Nobody knows of him anymore. He's not taught in your classes in Bangla. But at the time when Bankim Chandra was a young man, nobody emblematized Bengali poetry more than Ishwar Chandra Gupta. So, writing an introduction to Ishwar Chandra Gupta's poetry in 1885, Bankim Chandra asked the question, Kobi ke, who is a poet? Who is a poet is the question he actually asked over there. I'm not even going into the category of Indian, but you'll see why I'm beginning with this when I'm answering a question. Now, first Indian poet you're asking, because Bankim Chandra makes a very interesting point over there. He says Kobi. So let us go to the Indian languages then, because you're saying, first Indian poet. So if you look at Bengali, Bankim Chandra points out in this introduction that the word Kobi was used towards the beginning of the 19th century for the Kobial groups. So the groups that you see in the film Antony Firingi, I always mention the film because almost anybody who thinks of Antony Firingi thinks of it through the film. But the Kobial groups of early 19th century Bengal, Horu Thakur, Ram Boshu, Onik Dolce, there were many Kobial groups. They basically were called Kobi. So he's saying early 19th century, they were called Kobi, correct? Then he's going into ancient Indian history, and he's saying, and in the older days, he mentions Kalidas, Magh. He's saying these Kalidasa, Magha, these were the people that we knew as poets, Then he's saying, but now what we know to be Kobi, mane to Bangla likhchen, but I'm not quoting from the Bangla. Now what we understand to be Kobi is what in English is called the poet. He uses the English word, the poet. And the reason he is doing that is by 1885, these romantic, this romantic merging of style and subject that you're talking about, that has become, ingrained within writers who write either even in Bangla or in English, whichever language the writer is writing in. Poetry or the poet is modeled on the romantic poet. So yes, the answer to your question is this romantic merging of style and subject, in Desrosiers, certainly is to be found, but he's not. Whether he's the first Indian poet it can be found in, that is something that, we have to look at chronologically. Perhaps not. But what is more important is that this romantic merging of style and subject is what is leading to a complete transformation of the notion of the poet itself, which is why Ishwar Gupta by 1885 is not being counted as that sort of poet at all. Bankim Chandra is reinventing him as a Khati Bangali Kobi. Khati Bangali Kobi is Shobhab Kobi. Shobhab Kobi is who? Someone who sings, someone who composes, someone who writes in Poyar Chando, someone who's just doing something completely different. But if you look at, by the time of Bankim Chandra, his predecessor is Michael Madhusudhan Datta. Michael Madhusudhan Datta has reinvented the manner in which Bengali poetry is written. So he is a poet in the sense in which Michael is a poet, in the sense in which a poet is a poet by the time he's writing this introduction in 1885. So not just first Indian poet, first what is a poet itself is being reformulated at this time. And yes, it is a romantic merging of style and subject that is leading to a new conception of poetry and who the poet is among not just people who write in English, among people who write in any language at all. So I hope that answers your question to some extent.
Right, Boyjanto, you have you exhausted your questions, or do you want to ask anything else?
So what is Desrosiers' exact approach towards modernism?
Modernism was nowhere on the scene when Desrosiers was dead by 1831. Modernism is coming into existence in only in the 1920s, so a whole century later. So unless you mean modernity, modernism as a literary movement has no relationship with Derozio at all. It'll be ahistorical to put the two side by side.
Okay. Bojunto, I think we'll move on to the next question now. And Rosinka, there are two questions in the chat box. I think we could take the second one first, because it links with this question of romanticism which you were talking about. So Madhurima is asking, can you please enlighten us about the influence of English romantic poets upon Derozio as they existed in almost the same era, and how Derozio used the romantic tradition within his poems, while the theme and context had Indian connections. Okay, so she's asking almost an examination question. Right. Okay.
So it's a very good.
If you could sort of turn your microphone and your camera on. Right. Maybe the microphone on. I'm sorry, the camera on.
So it's very useful to have the hello. It's useful to have it on chat, because then one can focus on the question itself as well. So it's good that Amrit brought us to this question first, because we were just now talking about this what Bojunto called the romantic merging of style and subject, and this relates to your question as well, because you're basically asking about the influence of English romantic poets on Derozio as they existed in almost the same era. Now, it's a very interesting question. Again, it's a slightly sort of complicated answer. It's not a sort of straight one-to-one answer. The first thing you need to remember is that they did exist almost at the same time, but the transference of new books, new poetry, and new material from England to Calcutta at this time is happening very, very quickly because of print media and print circulation. Firstly, the newspapers are printing up excerpts from Byron, excerpts from Shelley, reviews from the Edinburgh Review. There is a very, very thriving section to almost every English language newspaper, and of course the Bengali language as well, eventually, on literary matters, on poems and poetry and reviews of poetry. So Derozio's favorite English romantic poet was Shelley. I've said that in my introduction. You'll find the material there. You can just look it up. Shelley, why? Now you'll see that, in fact, interestingly, Derozio criticizes Sadi. He is very, very. Now this brings me to the other thing about the English romantic poets, which we don't normally, when we talk about the English romantic poets in our over here, and maybe it's different now, but certainly when we were students, one tends to think of Wordsworth and Coleridge and Tintern Abbey and nature and that sort of subject matter. What we tend to forget is that the romantic poets, of course, were also intensely political, and the most political of them all was Shelley. Well, I'm making the claim Shelley. I'm saying most political of all because he actually wrote down his political beliefs. Byron may not have written them down in that form, but Byron went himself to fight, for the Greeks. So these are very, very political people, and that is one of the reasons why Derozio also is influenced by these English romantic poets. He is also, however, and again, this is something I say in the introduction, he is also, however, influenced by slightly earlier notions of late 18th century Indian poets, like Thomas Campbell, for instance, whom he keeps quoting. And I've quoted from Suvir Kaul in my introduction itself to show how this is a time preceding the Romantics when poetry is intensely political. So Suvir Kaul quotes from the man who wrote "Rule Britannia." You know that famous anthem, "Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves." It's used to be sung, but it was a poem first. Now Thomson, the man who wrote that poem, basically, poetry was also written for political reasons. And Derozio, you will see in many of his poems, is very, very political. So, where he, freedom to the slave, that is directly coming out of his own investment in the anti-slavery, campaign that is happening all over the world at this time, not just in England, but in America and everywhere else. So again, what I've tried to show in my introduction also is how interconnected this world was. It's literally, we talk about the internet connecting us nowadays and the explosion of, social media connecting us. But in the early 19th century, the manner in which print media and print circulation connected everybody was completely unprecedented, completely new, and also very, very effective. So, although you're right that the English Romantic poets are being published almost at the same time, they're reaching Calcutta almost at the same time. This is the very interesting thing, about the colonial era. And you don't even have to wait for the journey of a ship bringing the books. I mean, you might have to wait for that for the books, but somebody will print it up in a newspaper, and that newspaper will be carried by somebody, and then somebody over here who's editing a paper in Calcutta will print up the verses themselves as they're printed up in newspapers. So there is a great deal of influence of the English Romantic poets upon Derozio, not just in style and subject matter, but also in terms of politics. That goes without saying, and it doesn't matter that they're actually writing in the same era. And then the next part is, you're saying how Derozio used the Romantic tradition within his poems, while the theme and context had Indian connections. Yes, of course, this is a point that that I've made with some force, and of course needs to be made, which is that he is an Indian. He is identifying as an Indian. He's writing as an Indian. Remember also that racial prejudice exists is becoming increasingly stronger and stronger with the arrival of the British. Again, what recent research is showing is that there was a great deal of fluidity before that. It is only once the British arrived that the British become very, very sniffy about who is English, who is European, who is not, you could not be admitted into society unless you were. So this pure. So it's coming from race theory and all of that, but that will be later on in the 19th century, though. The British just brought this prejudice with them, and in many of the writings of Young Bengal that I'm looking at now, they're just surprised by this thing which doesn't have a name called racism as yet. But one of my Young Bengal people are saying that this prejudice that the British have is almost like the caste prejudice of Hindus, except that it has no religious injunction. So it's a societal thing, but the English bring it with them to India, and Derozio's identifying as an Indian also, to a large extent, belongs to this self-consciousness and being made aware by the British also that you're not one of us, you're not European, you're not English, and he himself being proud enough to then say that, well, I am an Indian and I want to be thought of as an Indian. So obviously, of course, his poems will have themes and contexts that are Indian. The one that I was most pleased by to discover for the first time, and therefore I put it in the book, is the sonnet to the Rajanigandha. That is something that that had not been seen before. I actually found it in the British Library and put it into this book. But somebody who you're calling the first Indian poet in English, European superiority, elites, blah, blah. But the Rajanigandha is one of the commonest flowers of Bengal. And when we think of flowers, we think of Rajanigandha. And the fact that this poet is writing of the Rajanigandha in a sonnet, whether in English or in whichever language, doesn't really matter then anymore, because really it is Indian poetry. So yes, he is using using the Romantic tradition, both politically and literary convention, and of course his themes and contexts are self-consciously, and he wants them to be Indian. No question about that. Thank you for your question.
Yes, it's interesting. We included sonnet to the Rajanigandha in the syllabus, and interestingly, the point that was made in the book that you edited about the fragrance of the Rajanigandha as it moves from India towards other shores, and the ways in which poetry is becoming almost a kind of a cosmopolitan kind of, let me not call it commodity, but a cosmopolitan vehicle, as it were.
Currency, yeah.
Currency. And interestingly, also, this is also the time when Dwarkanath is there. So, this question about India as this racial othering and the inferiority of the question about the inferiority of the Indian is not something which is very dominant, I guess, during this particular period. It's probably being formed, but not exactly ossified in the way that the late 19th century will see it.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, that's true.
We have something from Shamarpon Mukherjee, if you take a look at the next question.
Yeah.
He says, Dirozio seems to be rather polite and non-extremist regarding his language when he criticizes the dogmatism of Hindu society in his poetry. But in the case of the Young Bengal movement, many of the supporters are often associated with hooliganism and extreme measures. My question is, why does this difference in approach come when we consider Dirozio's poetry and the Young Bengal movement?
So, I could have said in response to that, Dirozio is the teacher, Young Bengal are the students. Students are always more associated with hooliganism and extreme measures. Except that, of course, I cannot say that. I can't make that point because, again, as I pointed out in the book, there is hardly any age difference between Dirozio and his students. Dirozio is 18 years old. His students are 16, 17 years old. They are really actually friends. He is their teacher. Of course, he has been appointed their teacher by Hindu College, but he's very, very young. And the students themselves are the final school leaving class of students, at least, are 16, 17 years old. So that is not an answer that I can give you. But polite and non-extremist regarding his language is, something that is more to do with poetic convention and poetic language than anything else. Young Bengal, after all, are not writing poetry. They are leading political movements. They are leading social reform. They are creating, yes, you're quite right, hooliganism, I will not say, but they are shocking and scandalizing society by refusing to believe in Hindu orthodoxy or in Hindu rites and rituals. So yes, and that is legendary. I mean, all of you know all the, whatever, drinking of beer and eating of ham and all that is actually, it's like a curtain that is drawn over your eyes, I think, when you think of this group of people, because they actually did, as I'm discovering now, the more and more I work on them, they actually did so much serious work that it's amazing how they have actually been sidelined from serious discussion. So hooliganism and extreme measures were there, but then they were not there. They weren't writing poetry. See, if some of Young Bengal wrote poetry, they would have found it very difficult to put that in language of hooliganism and extreme measures, because as you know, in any poetic tradition, you follow the poetic convention. Mirza Ghalib is writing his ghazals much later. He belongs to the 1850s. But you will not find, hooliganism or extreme measures there either, even though he too liked his drink, which Young Bengal have been accused of as well. But that is not the language in which you write poetry. It is just you follow literary convention and you write poetry in a certain way. What is important is the subject matter you choose. So Freedom to the Slave is a political poem, but you don't write that poem itself in terms of, in these sorts of terms until much later. If you're thinking of the 20th century, if you're thinking of Allen Ginsberg and the beat poets, yes, then you can talk about extreme measures, certainly extreme drug use, but not at this time, not in the time of Dirozio.
Thank you, ma'am.
Other thing that interested me in your response is, Rozika, I was just taking a look at the kind of movement through which the Bengal Renaissance went through. And it's very interesting that while we dismiss the Young Bengal movement as a kind of a meteor that sort of fizzled out, so many of the ideas that the Young Bengal circulated, right, went into the making of the Bengal Renaissance. And while we do not actually think of the Dirosians as kind of leading to this path, but this, for example, this interest in print culture, the concept of the debate, the reforms, all of them seem to have found a when they became, as it were, respectable, and many of them held very important portfolios, that earlier sort of meteoric energy seems to have been channelized into significant reformist zeal as the century sort of deepened.
In fact, Amrit, the interesting thing is that I'm discovering through new materials. Now, one of the main reasons that actually, and this is a, you know, what is that popular saying? Fools rush in where angels fear to tread. So basically, you know, it was because I realized as a student at Oxford, in fact, when my supervisor asked me to recommend to him a book on Young Bengal. And I went to the Bodleian Library and I looked up, those days you used to look up card catalogs, right? So, you know, I looked up all the, you know, catalogs that I could find, and I saw then that there is actually no book on Young Bengal. So I recommended what is still recommended to students, the Shumit Sarkar essay on complexities of Young Bengal, Shushobhan Sarkar notes on the Bengal Renaissance, but actually there is no book in that way. Now, after the work on Derozio, when a lot of other extra material also was generated, I always had it in my mind that I must, since I've looked so much at this period already through Derozio, I should do something on Young Bengal. And that is when, like a fool, I, you know, thought that perhaps I could write a book on Young Bengal since it has not been written yet. However, I understand now why it has not been written. And I'm very sorry that I took this project on because it's just, you know, going on and not finishing. And it's not, and that is because of a difficulty with regard to materials. Because this early part of the 19th century is not available over here. You have to go to the British Library. You have to go and look up the newspaper archives over there. You have to dig up this material. And it's one thing to dig up a few poems and writings by Derozio. And again, that I managed to do because I was assured in my mind that he died very young. He was only 22. How much can it come to, you know, new material? So it didn't come to that much. But with regard to this entire period of the 1830s and 40s, actually the archive is not here, it's in the British Library. And what little work was done by the likes of Pallab Sengupta or especially Gautam Chattopadhyay. Gautam Chattopadhyay has 2 volumes where he reprints essays by them. He went to the British Library and brought back, you know, physically brought back sort of Xeroxes and worked from those. So I understand now how difficult it is, and that's the main reason, I think, because of a paucity of materials that, and also, okay, that's one, if I'm to be very respectful and give it, you know, sort of, but to my mind, it seems, and I will argue the case, that it is also prejudice. It's not just positive materials, it's also prejudice, because from the late 19th century onwards, from the time of Dinesh Chandra Sen onwards, this group of people began to be described. Anyway, they'd always got a bad press, but then they began to be described as denationalized, hyper-westernized. These are the terms, and I'm quoting, these are the terms Dinesh Chandra Sen used. You know, these are people who don't know anything about their culture. They're writing in English, they read English poetry, and they write in English, and they drink, and who are they? You know, and that embarrassment actually is causing even right down to the subaltern historians. So any of the historians, whether they are nationalist historians from the time of Jadunath Sarkar, whether they are, or R.C. Majumdar, whether they are Marxist historians, you know, or whether they are the late, you know, of the last sort of variety I will mention are the subaltern historians, all of them are embarrassed for various reasons. The subaltern historians will say, well, you know, there is nothing about the peasantry there. You know, there's a certain invalidation that happens automatically from the prejudice of historians as well. So I'll try and make this point. We'll see whether anybody is convinced at all by anything I say. But yeah, that's basically, you know, in response to your question about Young Bengal and yeah, their significance. So should we? Take Saurav Kapri's question next, or? So this is regarding a systematic and structural hybridization infusing degree of the Orientalist perspective of the West, yes, and at the same time retain the very Indianness in Spoon. Alongside this, he also emphasizes. Sorry, Amrit, has your screen frozen? No, you're there. Yeah. Okay. emphasizes how the language English can be a mode of singing this glory. One, isn't that an attempt to appease the English people, or to say a precautionary measure taken in case his own people turn against? But the English are not his own people. That's what I've been saying. I've just been saying that ad nauseum, so I won't go into more details of that answer again. There is no attempt to appease the English people, and certainly, so again, when you say English people, who are the English people? I mean, in Calcutta at this time, there are various categories of English people. It is the East India Company officials who wield power. It is the people in government positions, magistrates and collectors who wield power. There are many, many English and European people in Calcutta at the time who are in fact working with Dwarkanath, with Young Bengal, to establish rights for Indians. So not everybody, so English people firstly can't be a single category to even apply to early 19th century Bengal. And certainly there's no attempt to appease them. And precautionary measure taken in case his own people. Who are his own people? His own people are Indians. So yeah, I think there's some confusion over here, which relates to the answers I've given to the previous question. So I hope you won't mind if I don't go into that in great detail again. The second thing you're asking is positional superiority without anyone being aware to he's trying to maintain a balance between the Anglo-Indian and the Indian. So that's two different compartments to the question, really. Positional superiority, in fact, is one thing he didn't have in relation, certainly, to the English, upper classes in Calcutta at this time. He is, in fact, positionally inferior. He's mixed race. People are dismissing him as this mixed race person. So he has no positional superiority in relation to the English. At least certainly in relation to the, again, to maintain my own sort of answer to your previous question, certainly in relation to the race conscious English, it's racially prejudiced English, the official English, people who are racist. It's a simple sort of way to put it. There are Englishmen in India at this time who are not racist as well, like Henry Meredith Parker, whom he seems to have known quite well, and whose dinner parties he seems to have gone to quite regularly. So basically, positional superiority without anyone being aware would have been impossible anyway. There's no positional superiority with regard to them, and there's no positional superiority with regard to Indians either. The Indians, especially the Hindus, as you well know, have a complete disdain for mixed race, forget about, I mean, they will not even sit down to eat with you if you're not, I mean, if your shadow crosses their path, they will, if you belong to the wrong caste and you are, as you know, even now in some places in the country, so positional superiority in the Indian belief systems and in the Indian religious systems is accorded to you by caste. And again, Desrosiers is mixed race. He's not of their caste. He has no positional superiority with regard to them at all. So there's no positional superiority, full stop. And is he trying to maintain a balance between the Anglo and the Indian? Yeah, absolutely. Of course he is. He does that throughout his life. And it's one of the political missions of his life to actually maintain a balance between the Anglo and the Indian. No question about that.
Right. Incidentally, I was just reminded of the incidents at Hindu College, where nobody actually stood up for him. Neither did the British. Of course, most of the Hindus did not, apart from one person, maybe.
Yeah. They all wanted him out. They didn't want him corrupting their children.
Right. Rosinka, the next question comes from Tasnova, and we actually did part of the Fakir of Jangira, the episode of Nalini's, rescue from the Sati, and Desrosiers' poem on Sati. So I think that is a question which is coming with that reading at the back of our mind. So death occurs to Nalini 2 times, first as a tradition of Sati and second as a suicide. Had it been the case, she would have committed suicide or voluntarily participated. She felt the same way for her husband. So my question is, isn't there a contradiction between what Desrosiers is trying to convey and what he's trying to actually, what he's showing? Because ultimately the woman has to die either ways. Slightly convoluted. Would you like to respond to that?
So it's not actually, okay, there's more over here. We see Sati as a barbaric process. imposed upon women. And if we see her an act of rebellion, she voluntarily chose death, then is he suggesting that dying for love is better than dying for tradition? That's an interesting question. Die for love than to die for tradition. He would have said yes, of course. As a romantic poet, certainly dying for love is a great and glorious thing. Dying for tradition is absolutely not. You don't. That is not something you want to do as a romantic poet or as any emancipated, politically sort of progressive person at that time. So yes, you're quite right that ultimately the woman has to die either way. But one thing I will point out here, and especially because you have obviously studied the poem, and you not only studied the poem, you studied the poem where Nalini becomes a sati. I think the most significant part of that poem lies in its footnote, where Derozio is basically saying in this poem, written in 1828, 1 year before it is banned in 1829. So at a time when Rammohun Roy must have been actively campaigning to get signatures to ban it, signatures to put on the petition. At this time, when Rammohun Roy is trying to do this, Derozio is writing in a footnote to the poem that the customs of the Hindus should not be interfered with. Now, and in fact, he says that it's more important to look at the plight of the widow. The Hindu widow is someone who needs far more rescuing. So again, it's complicated. There are various strands over here. With regard to why is Derozio, of course, in 1829, once the ban is implemented, he's writing a poem to celebrate it. So, poem on the abolition of sati is a long poem that he writes, and that is immediately printed in the India Gazette as soon as sati is banned. And he's very happy there that sati has been banned. So don't make that mistake. But in 1828, barely a few months before this, he is against the ban. Why? Now, he is against the ban actually because he's a liberal. What he's trying to say is that let the Indians decide for themselves. Who are you as the colonizing power who have come here, who know nothing about Hindu customs, Hindu beliefs, Hindu faiths? Their tender feelings, if I remember correctly, is a word he uses. You know nothing about these things. And you come with your own ideas of what is right and what is good, and you decide that this is a bad thing. But if it affects the tender feelings of the Hindus, then you should leave it to them to decide for themselves. So it's actually a liberal position he's taking, although that liberal position is then resulting in him saying that he does not support the ban. So this is all there in the book. I mean, you can look it up. It's there in print. But I think that is actually one of the more interesting things that happens. And with regard to ultimately the woman has to die either way, I think the best answer to this has been given by Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak in Can the Subaltern Speak, when she basically, points out that the subaltern, and in this case, the subaltern, of course, is doubly subaltern because it is the subaltern woman, cannot speak. And when she says cannot speak, of course, many people, if you have read the essay and if you know the importance of the essay, you will know that many people then wrote, to say that historically, no, of course, they spoke, some sati cried out on the pyre and all that. The point she was making, of course, is not that. The point she's making is that there is no space for utterance within discourse. So the discourse is constructed by patriarchy. The speaking voice is also assigned by patriarchy. In such a situation in this time, there is no space for the woman's voice to be heard. So I think the best answer to the question you're asking for, and over here, in fact, Spivak says 3 times, subaltern 3 times, also because she's also colonized. She's also a colonized woman. So under imperialism as well. So under imperialism, under patriarchy, and then so I think Spivak's essay is a very useful reference for you if you want to look at this notion of agency and of the subaltern, of the woman as subaltern voice. Yeah, and I think I answered that about dying for love better than dying for tradition already. Yeah.
Right. Radhika, I was rather interested, because following up on this question about the total absence, which although you mentioned this, of Rammohun in his poem on the abolition of sati, it's almost, it's a kind of official poem that he writes to the English administrator. Although, as you yourself mentioned, the last essay that he probably wrote was on Raja Ram Mohan. So, how do you look at this particular poem and the absence of the Indian role here?
That's a very interesting thought, actually. I know what you mean exactly. Sorry, I'm just making a note to myself to to address this in if it comes up again. He doesn't mention Ram Mohan. You're quite right. I have been asked over the past year or so about the relationship between Ram Mohan Roy and Young Bengal. And as far as I can see, Ram Mohan Roy was too conservative for Young Bengal. Ram Mohan, as you know, did not give up his Brahminical practices. When he went to England, he took his Brahmin cook with him. He maintained his Brahminical rites and rituals. He may have been accused by, Orthodox Hindus of eating meals with Europeans. And of course, he did eat many meals with Europeans when he went to England itself. But Ram Mohan was a man of religion. Ram Mohan established the Brahmo Samaj. Ram Mohan went deep into the nature of the Hindu religion and fought for what he thought was the Upanishadic and actual form of true Hindu religion. Correct? Now, Desrosiers and his students, and let's just stay on Desrosiers here because we're not even talking about his students, is not someone who's interested so much in, the religious or in God in that sense, in that spiritual sense. He is a far more, he's more of a political animal. He's more interested in social reform. He's more interested in David Hume than in, whether God is Nirakar or Akar. So I wouldn't be surprised, that this is pure speculation though, Amrit. I wouldn't be surprised if he doesn't mention Ram Mohan simply because there is a distance between Ram Mohan and himself or his own group that existed even while they were both in Calcutta at the same time, and therefore led him to celebrate the abstract principle that the ban embodied, rather than the man. And we give Ram Mohan as the also come of liberal enlightenment. If Ram Mohan may have, people gathered, there were 33,000 signatures against Ram Mohan. Ram Mohan had only, I don't know how many. Now, there were far more people. If it was going to be done democratically, certainly Ram Mohan would have lost. So it is actually Bentinck and those in power and their notions of, good enlightened liberal policy that actually makes the ban possible. So our nationalist histories we don't like to give the English, any credit even where it is due. But I will stick my neck out and say that Ram Mohan could not have done it without Bentinck supporting it. So maybe that's why Desrosiers is focused more upon the abstract principles and the larger sort of thought processes that made it possible.
Thank you. Now there's a question by Shurab, which I'm not really very sure what he wants to ask. Was Desrosiers against Hinduism, and why did many of his students and followers start to convert into Christianity? Was this more because Desrosiers was inclined towards Anglicism than Orientalism?
Okay, that's again. I'll try and answer it briefly. I think the other thing is my answers are becoming sort of very long. It's 10 to 5 already. So I'll just try and answer that quickly. Was Desrosiers against Hinduism? No. What Desrosiers and his students were against was orthodoxy. And they were against the orthodox of any religion, which is why they were accused of being atheists. The Christians in Calcutta at the time were very angry with Desrosiers and his students because they did not subscribe to Christian beliefs either. It's not as if they said that, Christianity is good and Hinduism is bad. No, they said religion is bad. Orthodoxy in religion is even worse. So no, Desrosiers was not against Hinduism. He was against orthodoxy in any religion. Why did many of his students and followers start to convert to Christianity? None of them converted to Christianity. The first person I can think of who converted to Christianity who had anything to do with the English language and English writing was Michael Madhusudhan, and he, was a Hindu college student after Desrosiers died, not before, at least 10 years after. So none of Desrosiers' own students, among
Maybe
whom
Krishna Mohan? Krishna
Mohan did, but not, yes, Krishna Mohan did. Of course, Krishna Mohan became a reverend, but Krishna Mohan did so, was the only one to do so, and it has not been shown, and I think it cannot be shown that Desrosiers was in any way responsible, for that. Otherwise, the rest of his students also, might have converted. In fact, they were accused of atheism.
Atheism, yes, the charge that was brought against him at Hindu college also.
Krishna Mohan's conversion took a different path and a different route. And that is also a very interesting path and route. But by the way, while I was reading my, just recently, 2 or 3 days ago, I was reading this anecdote about how Krishna Mohan, even as a reverend, liked to dress in, dhuti and namaboli and play the khal and, kortal while, in church. So, how much exactly the Christianity translated into? No, he was a genuine, certainly he was a reverend, he was a genuine Christian, but there's a lot of confusion here between social, social norms and cultural norms. Just because he did that didn't make him an inauthentic Christian, certainly. So, but I just wanted to introduce it to complicate matters. But yeah, Krishna Mohan's conversion was along a different line, really, and I would still say that Desrosiers students did not convert en masse. It was only Krishna Mohan, and that was a different route he took. So if you're interested in Krishna Mohan, look up, the route that led him to Christianity.
Right.
Find it doesn't have very much to do with Desrosiers.
Right. It's been quite a long, quite a long session. So I will take two questions more, or there are 3 actually. Momita asks, did he want to participate philosophically through his writings in order to make his country free? Now there's the question of independence coming in, which I really don't know whether Desrosiers was at this
point. So you're right that these points are talking about the past glory of India, but not under British rule. Past glory of India, ancient India, Hindu India, ancient Hindu India is the past glory of India, not under British rule at all.
I think she means past glory of India, which was at that point of time under British rule.
Oh, I see.
Right.
Sorry. So now philosophically, Desrosiers is friendly with H.H. Wilson, who is a leading Orientalist scholar, as we know. So the question is, did he want to participate philosophically?
I think, because we talked about Tom Paine and the circulation of his book at that point of time in Bengal. So I think that question is probably coming from there.
I see. Now I've understood. So, yes, the Hindu college students were very enamored of Tom Paine. As you know, Tom Paine's Rights of Man sold at 5 times the value. Some American bookseller brought it on an American ship to the shores of Calcutta, and it sold at 5 times the value. So yes, it's a bestseller at this time among these students. But did they read it in order to make their country free? No, I don't think so. Because there is no sense at this time. It just becomes ahistorical because there is no sense at this time in the late 1820s, 1830s, even in the 1840s, I would say, of making the country free. No, in fact, they think of themselves as subjects of the British Empire. What they want and they demand, in fact, is the same as what Dadabhai Naoroji demanded, if you look at your history books, which is to give Indian subjects the same rights as the British subjects had. So they said that we are subjects of empire, but if the British subject has these rights, then we too deserve the. So what were they arguing for? The equality of man, the principles of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity. That is what they're demanding to be looked at as men. That is their demand, not so much to make their country free, because the demand to make their country free doesn't actually come into existence almost until Gandhi. Not even Surendranath Banerjee, not even Dadabhai Nauroji, not even the founding principles of the Indian National Congress demand a free country. The free country comes in the 20th century, the idea of that.
Right, there are two questions. Sorry, I'll cut you short, really. There are two questions which are more or less similar. One which asks, about his role as a poet, where he followed the Romantic poets as Shelley, Byron, and the other as a reformer through his students, where he followed Locke, Hume, and Paine. And there's this last question which has been asked by Devashish, where he asks which Derozio is more important, his identity as a poet or as an iconoclast?
They're inseparable. Yeah, both questions are related to each other. You're quite right. And I will say to you that Shelley and Byron themselves read Locke, Hume, and Paine. And it is impossible to separate poetry from politics at this time, as I was saying right at the start. So yes, there is poetry and there is politics, and sometimes it is one and the same thing. And following from there, with regard to the other question that you're pointing to, which is from Devashish, which is more important, as a poet or as an iconoclast? Both. Poets are, according to Shelley, the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Poets are expected to change the world, to reform the world. So poets are above, and especially the Romantic poet the poets are iconoclasts in every which way. So yes, those two are not split. Those two are the same thing, really, in a certain sense. Yeah.
It's the last question which we'll take today. So this is Anupam, who's asking, Derozio was criticizing the traditional orthodox belief in Hindu religion. Can we say in his poem Sonnet to the Pupils is indirectly paving the path of some sort of criticism on that? So I think he's meaning the Hindu religion or influencing his admirers, and he says, then I feel I've not lived in vain. So he's probably asking whether, what influence he must have had on the reform in Hindu religion. I think that's probably the question that he's asking.
His greatest influence was in social, in the reform of social mores. He cannot reform Hindu religion. He is not a Hindu. That part is being done by Ram Mohan Roy. Ram Mohan Roy is reforming Hindu religion by reinterpreting what Hindu religion is. And he's doing it throughout this period, before Derozio and after Derozio. He barely outlived Derozio by a couple of years.
But followers, the questions.
Yeah, through their followers. So certainly, there's no question that he's criticizing traditional and orthodox beliefs that I already said. But with regard to influencing the students, yes, but it is more in the context of liberal thought, social mores. Education of women, don't go and marry child brides, do not treat widows so badly, all these liberal enlightened notions that then slowly after a lot of struggle became turned into law over the course of the 19th century. He's basically implanting those ideas in their mind through poetry. Yes, he is trying to influence them, and he does influence them, and it is a very strong and enduring influence which I think has remained unacknowledged by Indian modernity, because we have disassociated ourselves from them, and we have said that, they are not us. But fortunately or unfortunately, they are us in many ways. The fact that I'm conducting this session with you in English, that you're writing your questions to be in English, if all of that is then construed by a century later to say, who are these people? Who was this Amrit Sen and Rosinka Chaudhary sitting and talking to a few elite students at this elite Vishwabharati University? Then that will be a bit of a misrepresentation, I think. So I will say to you that it's certainly the case that he wanted to influence them, and he did, and that influence has persisted in unacknowledged ways.
Well, Rozika, thank you. You see, I think it's amazing, because I haven't taught Derozio earlier. This was my first foray also. And let me say that, your book was my constant companion for quite a number of weeks. But the kind of, interest that was generated in the Young Bengal movement and the students coming in with and reading these texts in such great detail, I think probably also alerts us to the fact that this period of Indian history, which, we've talked about the latter half of the 19th century, but the early half of the 19th century has fascinated them, especially in the ways in which, the first contours of an Indian modernity, which you ended your sort of answer with, was in formation. This was the nascent period from which, it was trying to take off. Right. So I am interestingly teaching Ramanujan now to that. Right. So I'm taking a look at, say, almost, say, 150 years hence, what directions did poetry and modernities, especially Ramanujan writing in America, Derozio writing in India. So it's very interesting connections that we are drawing.
But you remember that anecdote that Ramanujan has in an essay of his where he talks about his father and how his father would have a caste mark on his forehead in the morning and do puja, and then he would wear his coat and suit and go and do his office work. And when he asked his father how he could inhabit both worlds at the same time, in fact, all of us do as Indians, don't we? We inhabit both. When we go and we do Durga Puja and dance, we are actually inhabiting both categories. We all do. His father had replied, because the brain has two lobes, he had said.
Right.
So that self-divided thing about the brain having two lobes, it's a condition of Indian modernity, and I think it informs all of us. Yeah.
Yes,
So
and the poem also, where it writes about the self-portrait, and he looks at the glass reflection and somewhere sees the signature of the father inscribed again. Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
So thank you. I really had one more question on this new project of yours, especially what you exactly mean by the empire of the middle class. But I think I'll stop here because I've held you back for a very, very long time. Thank you for sparing so much time for our students on behalf of them, because I'm not sure everybody might turn on their microphones and create a cacophony. But on behalf of them, I'm sure all of us are very grateful to you for your time, the energy that you've devoted, and your sharp and incisive comments on the questions that were put to you, right? So, and thank you also, students, for being here. And I think, this is what the university spaces should be, where, exchanges of ideas, broader interaction with the most reputed scholars in the field can bring to you. So I think this is an experience that they will cherish. I hope sometime later on you'll get to meet them in person, right? I always have this problem that we're staring at a lot of capital letters on the screen. So thank you, Rozika, once again. And with that,
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. Thank you, Amrit. And thank you very much for being here. Yeah.
Ma'am, for clarification, you have mentioned an essay named Partial something that I have missed because you have been cut off from the...
Yeah, I'll just type it in. Yeah, I'll just type it in. It's a book called Partial Recall, written by Arvind Krishna Mehrotra. It's a great book, by the way, where he takes English departments severely to task. He says they've done no work at all. All these people sitting in the English departments, what are they doing? So I think you'll have it as compulsory reading. Yeah. So thank you. Thank you again.
With all permission, Rozika, I'll share this with my students. We normally put it up on my YouTube channel, which is there so that the students can go back and listen to your comments more carefully.
Sure.
Right. I'll sort of send you a link also for this. And thank you again. Right. So with that, I'll bring this session to a close. Right. Have a very pleasant evening. Right. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.